Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a, well, frankly intimidating stack of research, ancient texts, you name it, and boil it all down to the core insights, the stuff you really need to know.
That's right. We do the wading through millennia of legal code so you don't have to.
Our mission, as always, is to get beyond the surface. We want to give you the deep context, sometimes the really shocking details, and figure out the underlying logic that, made history unfold the way it did.
And today we're taking a journey deep into the legal foundations of the ancient world. We're looking at both Athens and Rome.
Yeah, and we're not focusing on one big battle or, say, the fall of an empire, important as those are.
No, we're looking at something I think much more fundamental, more enduring, how these societies actually defined justice, how they tried to regulate moral life, and crucially, how they established state control over things that used to be completely private matters.
The sources we're digging into today are really fascinating because they let us almost track this evolution in thinking, almost in real time. We can see how power shifts.
Definitely. It's a real navigation from, say, the very old Greek idea that the family, the clan, had the right to vengeance.
The blood feud.
Exactly. All the way up to the huge bureaucratic authority of the Roman Empire sticking its nose into its citizens' private lives, their money, their families.
So the big question we're chasing across these two massive ancient civilizations is really, who got to punish people? Who got to decide what was right and wrong, morally speaking? And why did the state eventually grab that power for itself? Often, it seems, taking it away from the oldest institution of all, the family. Okay, so let's unpack this first part. Thinking about law starting out in ancient Greece, especially Athens, you really have to ditch our modern ideas, right? No central police force, no neat paperwork.
Absolutely. Forget CSI. Athens. Our sources point us straight to the messy, archaic root of justice, and that root is vengeance.
It sounds so primitive,
Yep.
but that was the starting point.
It was. And if you look at the earliest legal codes we have any record of, the parts about punishment, the penal legislation, it's often incredibly detailed and extensive and, frankly, bloody.
Like Draco's Code in Athens.
Yeah.
The one famous for being harsh.
That's the classic example. Tradition tells us it had these sanguinary penalties, that means bloodthirsty, which tells you right away that the first job of formal law wasn't really crime prevention as we think of it. It was about structuring retribution, giving it rules.
And the really crucial idea here, the one that kind of flips the script on the state just taking charge, is that this early system wasn't state-run at all. It was deeply rooted in the family, the king group, the clan.
That's it, exactly. The state bureaucracy, such as it was, came later. We see this spelled out in Draco's Law about homicide, about killing someone.
How so?
Well, the law actually required the victim's relatives, their kin, to make a public announcement, a proclamation. It was called a proipin. They had to declare it publicly against the person they accused of the killing.
Wow. So that one procedural step tells you everything. Justice starts as a family problem, a blood feud issue, and the state is kind of formalizing it, watching it.
Precisely. The state isn't replacing the feud, not yet. It's trying to bring it into the open, regulate it a bit.
I want to zero in on that proipin for a second. It's actually quite a brilliant bit of legal thinking, isn't it? The state isn't ordering them to stop fighting.
No.
It's saying, look, if you are going to pursue this feud, you have to announce it publicly, where we can see.
That's exactly the dynamic. The proipin forces the family to commit publicly under the state's gaze. It makes the whole process less, spontaneous and chaotic. The state slides into the role of a legal witness, almost a referee, to this private fight. And by doing that, it slowly starts building its own legitimacy. It mediates first before it tries to prosecute directly, a very gradual power grab.
And this idea of family solidarity, sticking by your kin no matter what, it was incredibly powerful, right?
Yeah.
So powerful that going against your family was seen as, well, fundamentally wrong, irreligious almost.
Oh, deeply impious. Regardless of the actual crime, you just didn't break ranks. The classic philosophical example, though maybe semi-historical, is the Euthyphro case from Plato's dialogue.
Right, the man who wants to prosecute his own father.
Exactly, and the whole setup shows the expected Athenian reaction to a homicide. Absolute family loyalty. You either go after the killer of your slain relative, or you stand by your own relative if they're accused. There's no middle ground.
So Euthyphro's saying he'll prosecute his own father.
Yeah.
That was shocking.
Hugely shocking. His family, according to the dialogue, reacts with disbelief and moral horror. They see it as profoundly impious, a violation of traditional piety, even if the father was guilty. The unwritten rule, the deep cultural expectation, was clear. If you suspected a Phalos Simon, someone dear to you, of murder, you were actually obligated to step aside. You let the victim's family, the enemies, handle the retaliation. You did not become the prosecutor yourself. That would be siding with the state against your own blood.
Okay, so we start with this absolute dominance of the family feud, which Draco's laws try to formalize but don't really control. How did Athens get from that point to a system where the state could actually claim the power of justice for itself? Build courts and juries.
Well, we see that huge shift reflected, or maybe even shaped, ideologically in Greek tragedy. Athenian tragedy is often this amazing mirror for the city's political and legal changes.
And the key text here is Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy, right?
Absolutely. It's the definitive story Athens told itself about this transition. It dramatizes that messy, awful cycle of family violence. Clytemnestra kills her husband Agamemnon. Their son Orestes kills his mother, Clytemnestra. It's bloody chaos.
And the cycle only breaks when Orestes is put on trial.
Yes, but crucially, it breaks not just because Orestes stops, but because the divine agents of that old blood vengeance, the Furies, are themselves transformed.
So that's the mythological founding of the Areopagus court. The Furies get replaced by a human jury overseen by Athena.
Well, not quite replaced. They get converted, which is even more interesting. They start as these ancient, terrifying figures in black robes, the hounds of the mother, symbols of blood guilt. But the trilogy ends not with them being destroyed, but with them being rebranded, you might say.
Rebranded.
They're given a new role. They become the maintainers of order, not just in the abstract, but specifically within the household and the city, the polis. They're given a new home, a place of honor on the Acropolis, and a new name, the Semnai, the revered ones.
So what's the deeper meaning of that? It sounds less like the state defeating the old blood feud system and more like it co-opted it, recruited its symbolic power.
I think that's exactly right. It's a really complex ideological move. It shows that the new legal system wasn't just swapping out old superstition for new rationality. It was actually absorbing those primal forces of vengeance and fear into the new state structure.
So the state basically says those terrifying forces you used to fear, they work for us now.
Precisely. And some critics argue, quite persuasively, I think, that this shift, which the Athenians celebrated as this great triumph of civilization and reason, was actually more about consolidating state authority, and specifically enforcing a kind of patriarchal order. They used the ancient fear, now embodied by the Semnai, to make people comply within the new civic rules. The state basically claims the monopoly on legitimate violence and retribution by taking over the spiritual justification for it.
That is a huge philosophical shift. And once the state controls punishment for major things like murder, it naturally starts looking at other kinds of behavior, right? Things that aren't just about physical harm, but about social order, dignity, maybe even class. Which brings us to this unique Athenian idea of hubris.
Yes, the law of hubris. It was really central to Athenian law, but it's often misunderstood today. It definitely targeted aggressive behavior, conduct that degrades, dishonors, or insults the victim.
Okay, that sounds somewhat familiar, like assault or maybe defamation.
Sort of. But the critical difference, according to our sources, is that hubris wasn't primarily about the physical act itself. It was a legal tool for regulating social hierarchy and dignity, especially in the context of Athens' very competitive democratic society. It was about preventing outrageous assertions of dominance.
So the real crime wasn't just, say, hitting someone. The crime was the act of intentionally destroying their social standing, their honor.
That's the core of it. The severity of the penalty often depended on the relative status of the perpetrator and the victim, and this comes out most clearly when you look at cases involving sexual misconduct.
How so?
The legal system, when dealing with hubris in a sexual context, seems much more focused on maintaining social hierarchy and public reputation than on, say, individual consent as we understand it today.
Wait, so if there was some kind of aggressive sexual act, the main legal question wasn't necessarily, did the victim consent?
Not primarily, no. The key questions were more like, was the passive partner dishonored by this act? And crucially, did this act therefore disrupt the social order?
Regardless of whether the victim technically submitted or was physically forced.
That seems to be the operating principle. The law punished sexual conduct that dishonored the passive partner, whether that partner was a freeborn boy, a slave, or someone else's wife, largely independent of the consent question. The real transgression was the public degradation, the assertion of dominance that crossed a line. It was about one citizen aggressively shaming another in a way that threatened the social fabric. Athenian law was trying to police the rules of that constant social competition.
Okay, so Athens has wrestled the power to punish away from the clan. It's formalized rules about dignity through hubris. Now, the state needs to organize its citizens. It needs people to pay for all this, the courts, the military, everything. And that organization really kicks off with Solon's famous reforms.
Absolutely. Solon's changes back in the Archaic period, around the early 6th century BCE, they really laid the groundwork for the democracy that came later. His big move was primarily timocratic.
Timocratic meaning based on timai, which is like
Right.
worth, value.
Exactly, but specifically value measured by property and wealth. Annual income, essentially. And this was a radical idea at the time because it shifted the basis of status away from just noble birth or which clan you belong to. Suddenly, it was about acquired wealth. That opened the door, potentially, for people who weren't aristocrats to gain political influence.
That's the key shift then. He changed what made an Athenian citizen politically important. So how did he actually structure this new hierarchy based on money?
He divided all the citizens into 4 distinct classes, and the divisions were strictly based on their annual income or the assessed value of their property. They measured it in things like medimni, that's like bushels of corn, or equivalent measures of oil or wine.
So tell us about the top tier, the super wealthy who really ran the show early on.
Right. The highest class were the pentakosio medimni, literally the 500 measurement. These were the guys who produced 500 medimni of grain, or its equivalent in other goods, per year. And only they were eligible for the top jobs, the archonship, which was the chief executive role, and all the high military commands.
Okay, so top wealth equals top power. What about the classes below them?
Below them came the hippeis, the knights. These were men wealthy enough to afford and maintain a war horse for the cavalry. Then you had the zeugetai, who were basically the middle class. They could afford the armor and weapons to serve as hoplites, the heavy infantry that formed the backbone of the army. And then the lowest class, the thetes, were mostly laborers with little or no property.
So your wealth directly determined your military role and your political eligibility, officially. And this strict layering, maybe surprisingly, led to something that looks a lot like an early form of progressive taxation.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating from a, financial design perspective.
It did, yeah. And it shows how pragmatic Solon was trying to be. The sources suggest this early system of graduated taxation was quite sophisticated for its time. The way it worked was complex. Basically, your rateable property, the amount you'd be taxed on, was put on the state's list, and that amount was calculated based on your annual income class.
Okay, but how did the graduation part work? How did they make the rich pay proportionally more?
The key step was that the proportion of your income that counted as taxable capital went down sharply for the lower classes.
Can you give us an example? Like, how would it work for someone in the top class versus the middle class?
Sure. Imagine a pentakosio medimni, one of the top guys. His taxable property might be assessed at a rate that's, say, equivalent to 100% of his actual annual income. But a zeugetai, the hoplite class guy, his property might only be assessed at, say, 50% or 60% of his actual income for tax purposes.
Ah, I see. So when the state levied a tax, say 1% on that assessed capital.
Exactly. The wealthy person ends up paying 1% of their full income, while the middle-class person pays 1% of only half their income. Effectively, the wealthy were taxed at a significantly higher rate relative to their total earnings. It functioned very much like a graduated income tax. The idea was that those who benefited most from the state's protection and infrastructure should contribute the most to maintain it.
This focus on shared burdens, even if they were graduated by wealth, must have fed into the democratic ideology that developed later on. Once Solon's structure was in place, what did the Athenians, especially in the democracy, claim was the absolute bedrock of their system? The rule of law.
Yes, absolutely. The democratic ideology hammered this point home constantly. The rule of law, they called it isonomia. Equality under the law was praised as the cornerstone of good government. You hear it all the time in the speeches and writings. Law was supposed to be universal, equal for everyone, the thing that preserved the city's freedom. Demosthenes, the Great Orator, explicitly argued that Athens was prosperous and free precisely because it lived under established, known laws.
Okay, hold on though. How can they claim universal equal law when we just talked about these 4 strict wealth classes that determine who could hold office, who had to serve in which military role, and how much tax they paid? Doesn't that completely contradict the idea of equality?
That's a really important question, and it gets to the heart of what they meant by equality. The sources suggest the Athenians drew a really key distinction. They valued procedural equality much more than actual status equality or economic equality.
Procedural equality.
Meaning the law, the process, was the same for everyone. Every citizen, regardless of their wealth class, theoretically had the same constitutional protections. The rules were supposed to be known, written down, and applied the same way in court. That was the crucial difference, in their eyes, between a democracy and an oligarchy. Oligarchs, they argued, thought they were above the law. They'd bend the rules or make them up as they went along. Democracies, on the other hand, preserved freedom because everyone, rich or poor, was subject to the same legal process. So your political opportunities might be unequal based on wealth, but your legal protections were meant to be equal.
That's a fascinating distinction. Equality of process versus equality of outcome or status. Still, even with this idea of universal law, the sheer demands the state placed on its citizens, especially the wealthiest ones, must have created constant friction.
Oh, huge tension. It was chronic. You have this civic ideal, right, that being a good citizen should be a voluntary thing. A free man willingly, enthusiastically contributing to the polis. It's a beautiful idea.
But the reality was different.
The reality often clashed violently with the state's enormous demands, particularly military service being called up for hoplite duty and these incredibly expensive financial obligations called liturgies.
Liturgies, those were like public services funded by rich individuals, right?
Sure.
Like commanding a warship.
Exactly. The triarchy commanding and paying for the upkeep of a trireme warship was probably the most famous and most burdensome. It was basically like being forced into private military contracting for the state.
And cripplingly expensive, I imagine.
Astronomical. And the state needed a lot of ships, so the demand was constant. This pressure naturally led to resistance. We see evidence everywhere that people tried to get out of these duties. Draft evasion for military service seems to have been tempting and maybe surprisingly common, even for average citizens. People would fake illnesses, claim exemptions, maybe even just leave town when the call-up happened.
And this wasn't just quiet grumbling.
No, it caused real public anxiety. You see it reflected in the political speeches demanding crackdowns on draft dodgers, and even in comedies making fun of cowards who shirked their duty.
So if the wealthy, who had the most political clout, were constantly trying to avoid these massive costs like the triarchy, how did the state actually keep them contributing? How did they ensure compliance without, provoking a revolt from their most powerful citizens?
Yeah, the state couldn't just dictate terms. It had to negotiate constantly with its wealthiest and most powerful sector.
Yeah.
For those really big liturgies, like the triarchy, the rich eventually won significant concessions.
Like what?
Like getting a guaranteed period of exemption from having to do it again. This was known as exilia triarchius, immunity from the triarchy for a certain number of years after you'd done it once.
So it wasn't just the state being nice.
Definitely not charity. It was a hard-nosed political reality. They granted these exemptions partly in recognition that these individuals had finite resources, even if they were rich. But also, crucially, it was a way to respect their political power. In the democracy, these wealthy citizens still held significant influence. So it was a trade-off. You fund the state's essential projects, sometimes at enormous personal cost, and in return, the state grants you some breathing room. It shows the state knew that getting consistent, willing compliance, even from the elite, was ultimately more important than trying to enforce absolute equality of burden. The law had to bend to political reality sometimes.
Okay, we've seen Athens move from this clan-based vengeance system toward state control using wealth and this idea of procedural law as its main tools. Now let's make a complete shift over to Rome, because the foundations of Roman law look really different, don't they? It seems to start not so much with the city-state and the individual citizen, but with this incredibly powerful, almost monolithic family unit.
That's absolutely right. The Roman legal system at its very core was built around the patriarchal aggregate, the family unit, the familia. And the key thing to grasp is that the Romans considered this institution, the familia, to be older and in some ways more fundamental than the state itself.
Older than the state, wow.
Yeah, and primitive Roman legal thinking didn't really see the family as just a collection of individuals like we might. It saw the familia as a single legal entity, almost like a corporation, headed by the paterfamilias, the oldest living male ancestor.
That distinction sounds massive. It implies that the family unit itself, under the father's control, had the same kind of legal standing, the power to own property, make contracts, govern its members, that maybe an individual man would have in later legal systems.
That's a great way to put it. The power of the father, the patria potestas, was immense within the family structure. And the bond between a father and his son, for instance, wasn't just seen as a social thing. It was viewed almost as a biological, metaphysical fact. Our sources emphasize that the father could never really stop being the father, legally or otherwise.
Is there evidence showing just how hard it was to break that legal bond between father and child?
The traditional ritual for emancipation, freeing a son from his father's power, is the most striking example. It was incredibly complicated legally. Later procedures reflecting the difficulty embedded in the ancient 12 tables sometimes required the son to go through this elaborate legal fiction where he was symbolically sold into slavery and then immediately freed. And this had to be done 3 times to finally sever that incredibly strong ancient legal tie.
Sold into slavery 3 times, just to be legally independent from his father.
Exactly. The sheer complexity and drama of that ritual tells you just how much weight the Romans put on the paterfamilias and the unity of the familia. The legal system saw the family not just as a social arrangement you could easily dissolve, but almost as this immutable natural unit.
That detail is just astonishing. It really paints a picture. Now let's look at Rome's own foundational law code, the 12 Tables, from around the mid-5th century BCE. How did their approach to crime and punishment compare to those really early vengeance-focused codes we saw in Greece, like Draco's?
The 12 Tables definitely mark a significant step. Unlike the traditions about Draco's Code, where criminal law seems to dominate and focus heavily on retribution, the 12 Tables give much more space to what we'd call civil law. Things like property rights, contracts, rules about inheritance, how to handle disputes over boundaries. This stuff gets something closer to its modern prominence.
So more focus on regulating everyday life and commerce.
Yes, but that doesn't mean punishment disappeared. The redress of wrongs, how to deal with theft, injury, personal insults, damage to property, still took up a very large chunk of the 12 Tables. It shows that even as civil law was developing, a primary function of law was still managing and resolving those private conflicts and grievances.
Did the Romans, even early on, have a wider range of punishments available beyond just execution or exile, showing maybe a more nuanced approach than simple eye for an eye?
They did develop a pretty varied and, frankly, sophisticated set of penalties that fell short of execution. This gave Roman lawmakers more tools for social control and punishment.
Like what kind of things?
Well, there were various civil disabilities. The most famous is probably infamia. This was a kind of formal public dishonor. It meant losing certain legal rights, like the ability to hold office, testify in court in some cases, or manage property for others. It was social death, almost.
So punishment through public shaming and loss of status.
Right.
What else?
Financial penalties, of course. Fines, called multae. And various kinds of expulsion. They had relegatio, which was basically banishment, often temporary, sometimes to a specific place like an island, but without losing your citizenship or property necessarily. This range shows they were thinking about punishment in terms of social incapacitation, financial penalties, and public disgrace, moving beyond just simple physical elimination.
Okay, fast forward quite a bit now. The most dramatic shift in who controls the legal process in the Roman world comes much later, right?
Yeah.
Under the empire, the Principate, when the emperor himself starts to really centralize judicial power across this huge territory.
Yes, that's a massive transformation. Under the Principate, starting with Augustus, jurisdiction becomes much more centralized. Power shifts away from the old republican institutions like the standing jury courts, the questiones publicae,
And flows towards the emperor.
Exactly. The emperor's judicial power expands enormously, kind of falling into 3 main areas. First, he had primary jurisdiction cases he could just decide to hear himself right from the start. Second, there were cases referred up to him from lower courts, especially from provincial governors. And third, he became the final court of appeal for criminal cases. This effectively made the emperor the ultimate judge for the entire Roman Empire.
That centralization must have been absolutely crucial for holding such a vast empire together,
Yeah.
and maybe especially for keeping tabs on those powerful provincial governors out in places like Syria or Gaul.
It was vital, especially for protecting the rights of Roman citizens living outside of Italy. You had to draw a very clear legal line between a Roman citizen and a non-citizen provincial subject.
Yeah.
Provincial governors wielded a power called coercitio.
Cosidia, what was that exactly?
It was basically the raw power of a magistrate to compel obedience and maintain order through disciplinary action. Think fines, flogging, short-term imprisonment. And crucially, in the provinces, this power could be pretty sweeping, potentially arbitrary, and sometimes brutally applied.
So it's like the governor's personal authority to keep order on the ground. What stopped a governor from abusing that power? Especially if it involved something serious, like threatening a Roman citizen with execution. Was there a safeguard?
There was a fundamental constitutional shield for Roman citizens, the right of provocatio. Appeal. Originally, back in the Republic, this was the right to appeal a magistrate's capital sentence to the popular assembly in Rome.
And under the empire.
Under the Principate, this evolved into the right to appeal directly to the emperor or his designated courts in Rome. This right was a cornerstone of Roman citizenship. It meant that Roman citizens accused of capital crimes, serious offenses punishable by death, were protected from the potentially arbitrary or harsh justice of a local provincial governor using his coercitio.
So let's say you're a Roman citizen, maybe a merchant or a soldier, and you get arrested for a serious crime way out in, I don't know, Egypt or Britain. The local governor couldn't just sentence you to death right there.
No. If you asserted your citizenship and invoked your right of provocatio, you had the right to have your case transferred to Rome.
To be tried by whom?
Either by one of the established questions publicae, the jury courts that still existed, or, increasingly over time, by the emperor's own imperial courts. This mechanism was fundamental. It reinforced the special status of Roman citizens throughout the empire, provided a check on provincial authority, and underscored the emperor's role as the ultimate guarantor of justice. It was a powerful assertion of centralized legal procedure over local power. #4V, legal status of women and family law in Rome.
We established that the familia, headed by the paterfamilias, was the absolute bedrock of Roman law. But drilling down into that, the legal status of women reveals some really fascinating, maybe even contradictory aspects of Roman legal thinking, especially around ideas of legal capacity and individual agency. Let's start with this concept of guardianship, tutela.
Right. Roman law, as a general rule, placed women in a kind of perpetual legal minority, even if they were adults, even if they were married. This was formalized through this institution called tutela mulierum, the guardianship of women.
Perpetual minority. So they always needed a male guardian to handle legal matters.
Generally, yes, for certain significant legal acts, like selling certain types of property, making a will, or entering into major contracts. The justification given in our sources is starkly paternalistic. The famous jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century CE, puts it plainly. He says, "The ancients wanted women, even if they are of full age, to be in guardianship on account of their light-mindedness."
Wow. Light-mindedness. That's a pretty blunt assessment.
Yeah.
The legal system basically assumes women lack the seriousness or stability to manage their own affairs.
It certainly reflects a deeply rooted cultural assumption embedded in the law. It saw women, generally, as needing male oversight for their own protection, legally speaking. However, like with many Roman rules, the system wasn't totally rigid. The law itself created some very specific high-profile exceptions, which, in a way, just proved the general rule.
You mean like the Vestal Virgins?
Exactly. The Vestals, the priestesses who tended the sacred fire of Rome, were explicitly freed from tutela by a law that was set to go all the way back to the 12 Tables.
And why were they exempt?
It wasn't granted as some kind of recognition of female capability. It was framed as an honor, a special privilege granted because of their unique and vital religious role. Their sacred status essentially lifted them out of the normal category. Their release from male legal control was tied directly to their public function and ritual purity, which just highlights that for most ordinary Roman women, legal capacity wasn't seen as inherent, but conditional.
Okay, let's move forward into the imperial era again, because we see the state, especially under Augustus, starting to intervene much more directly in family matters, not just through this kind of background paternalism, but actively trying to shape family structure, maybe even for demographic reasons.
Yes, absolutely. Augustus embarked on this ambitious program of social reform. Part of his goal, after decades of civil war, was to restore what he saw as traditional Roman values, bolster the elite families, and, crucially, encourage them to have more children.
And this led to some major laws affecting family structure and legal status.
It did. The most famous are the Julian and Papian laws. One key element they introduced was something called the Curius Librorum.
The Curius Librorum, the right of children. What did that mean in practice? Did it relate back to guardianship, to tutela?
It related directly to it, but it wasn't some kind of universal emancipation for women. It was a specific reward mechanism tied directly to childbearing.
How did it work?
A freeborn woman who successfully bore 3 children, or a freedwoman, a former slave who bore 4 children, was granted freedom from tutela. She could then manage her own legal affairs without needing a guardian.
So wait, the path to legal independence for a woman was defined entirely by her reproductive success, by fulfilling her perceived duty to the state to produce more Roman citizens.
That's precisely the mechanism. It wasn't about her age, her intelligence, her experience, or her wealth. It was about hitting a state-mandated baby quota. If she didn't meet that quota, she generally remained under guardianship.
That really shows the state stepping in, doesn't it? Linking a woman's private biological function directly to her public legal status? It feels like the ultimate expression of the state claiming the authority to regulate private life for what it defines as the public good.
It absolutely is. It connects her reproductive role and her legal autonomy in this incredibly direct way, showing how far the state felt it could reach into the family to achieve its policy goals.
Now, despite this overarching legal theory of female light-mindedness and the need for control through tutela, when you look at how things actually worked on the ground, especially concerning property, the picture seems a bit more complicated. Did Roman women in practice manage to wield economic power?
They certainly did, but often in this kind of legal gray area, maybe characterized by some ambiguity in the formal legal thinking. For example, the law wasn't entirely clear or consistent about a woman's ability to dispose of wealth she inherited from her own family line, her matroia, as opposed to her dowry, which came from her husband's side or was managed differently.
So the theory was a bit fuzzy. But what about the reality? Are there examples that suggest women did control their own money?
Yes, we have practical examples from inscriptions and legal documents that definitely chip away at the strict theory. Consider a case involving a woman named Archippe.
What did she do?
She made a significant bequest in her will, 2,000 drachmas, which was a lot of money to her two children, specifically stating it came from her matroia, her maternal inheritance.
Okay, and was that challenged?
Yes, after her death, her stepson challenged the bequest. He argued, based on the prevailing legal theory, basically saying she shouldn't have had the right to give away that ancestral family wealth so freely. The case went to arbitrators.
And the outcome?
They actually awarded the stepson only a small fraction of his stepmother's property. The fact that Archippe's bequest to her own children was largely upheld strongly suggests that, in practice, women could and did exercise considerable control over at least some types of inherited wealth, even if the official legal doctrines about their capacity were, shall we say, dismissive.
And it wasn't just about wills, right? Women sometimes handled significant property transactions too, even involving family land.
Exactly. We have another example concerning the sisters of a man named Apollodorus. After their brother died, the sisters, acting through their husbands as their legal agents, sold off the family land and other possessions.
Okay, acting through their husbands might fit the tutela model, but what's significant about it?
What's significant is that the source notes this action was actually contrary to accepted family practice. It suggests that a strong family tradition about keeping land within the lineage was overridden. Even though they acted through their husbands legally, the decision seems to have originated with the sisters, and it went against the grain of expected family behavior.
So these examples highlight a gap between the strict letter of the law, or maybe the dominant legal theory, and the actual lived economic reality for some Roman women.
Precisely. While the legal theory might have emphasized female incapacity and the need for male control, the practical evidence shows that women could navigate the system, make significant financial decisions, manage wealth, and sometimes even push back against traditional family expectations. In these real-world situations, you see women's individual economic agency carving out space within that overarching patriarchal legal framework. #outro. So when you pull back and look at the whole sweep, what these sources really show us across centuries from, Draco's Athens right through to Augustus's Rome is this incredibly long, complicated, and often really tense struggle.
A struggle for what, fundamentally?
A struggle by ancient states to define and codify justice. And a key part of that was systematically pulling power, the power to judge, the power to punish away from the family unit, the clan, and concentrating it in the hands of the state apparatus.
And that process wasn't just about law courts. It also shaped what it even meant to be a citizen.
Absolutely. It simultaneously defined the duties and rights of a citizen, what was expected of them, and in doing so, it constantly threw up this inherent tension. A tension between individual will, individual agency, think of that Athenian trying to dodge the draft, or the Roman woman wanting control over her inheritance, and the ever-increasing demands of centralized legal control by the state.
Yeah, what's so fascinating is seeing how those lines, the boundaries between what's private life and what's subject to public rule, were never really fixed. They were always shifting, always being argued over, contested.
Exactly. Whether you're looking at an Athenian father wrestling with the huge financial burden the state placed on him for, say, funding a warship.
Or a Roman woman whose basic legal standing, her ability to act independently, was literally defined by an imperial law based on how many children she managed to bear.
In all these cases, you see the state pushing inwards, constantly redefining the personal spheres as political, as something subject to regulation for the greater good.
Which leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If so much of this ancient legal scaffolding, things like the Roman concept of a citizen's right to appeal, the provocatio, or their incredibly detailed legal categorization of family status with things like tutela and the ius liberorum, if that infrastructure still forms, maybe invisibly, the foundation of many modern Western legal systems,
Hmm.
well, where do we draw the line today?
Mm. Are we actually any clearer now than the ancients were about the boundary between regulating public order, something most people agree the state should do, and legislating private morality?
Think about the Athenians grappling with the social implications of hubris, or the Romans meticulously linking a woman's fertility to her legal freedom. How different really are the debates we have today about the state's role in our personal lives, our families, our choices? It's something to consider. Until the next deep dive.